So, hello, welcome to all to another edition of the Economics Online Seminar Series. Today we have with us Professor Richard Paulsen from Bloomsburg University of Pennsylvania, who will discuss his recent research on student loan debt and the career choices of college graduates with majors in the arts. And before giving him the word, I think Elizabeth will also say few additional words. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrea. I would like to remind the present and not present audience, the one who will watch this recording on YouTube, that if you are willing to present as the seminar of Cultural Economics Online, please don't hesitate to contact Andrei and or me. You just need to send an email. You can also recommend or suggest other scholars for interesting presentations during a cultural economics seminar online. Thank you.
Okay, and just before we start, I additionally add the webinar is recorded and will be available also online in a few days. Now we give the word to Richard. Thank you.
Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen and I'll get this presentation going. So as Anders said, the presentation here is entitled Student Loan Debt and the Career Choices of College Graduates with Majors in the Arts. And I'll emphasize that the focus here is on US graduates. I'm using US data. Now, before I get too far into this, let me give some background on motivation. Now, certainly here in the US, student loan debt has been receiving an increasing amount of attention in recent years. As for the magnitude of outstanding student loan debt in the US, as of late 2021, student loan debt exceeded 1.5 trillion, which, we're talking 5 to 10% of US GDP, which is quite a substantial amount of outstanding student loan debt. On a per student basis, there are about 43 million Americans with some level of student loan debt, and the average level of debt for those that have it is about 40,000. If you're thinking about like a monthly student loan debt payment, then we're talking about $400 in monthly student loan debt payments on average. And another reason that this has been kind of receiving attention in recent years is that it was a major talking point during the 2020 Democratic primaries. Here in the US, there were a number of Democratic candidates that were considering student loan debt forgiveness as a part of their platform. Certainly President Biden had made reference to forgiving $10,000 per graduate in student loan debt. There were other candidates that proposed even greater levels of debt. I believe Elizabeth Warren had thrown out a number of like $50,000 in student loan debt forgiveness. Bernie Sanders proposed getting rid of all of student loan debt. So it's certainly something that has received attention in US politics. There's also been some recent media attention drawn on this issue. And I'll point you to an article by Korn and Fuller in 2021 in the Wall Street Journal that highlighted not student debt associated with undergraduate degree programs, but actually student loan debt associated with master's degree programs. And among the master's degree programs highlighted in this article as having very high levels of debt to earnings were some arts programs from top US universities. A little bit more background on motivation here. Student loan debt has been talked about as an issue that's been associated with a lot of choices by millennials and younger generations here in the US. Research has found that student loan debt has had a negative impact on things like homeownership and having children in the US. And bringing this back to our arts graduates, student loan debt has the potential to affect graduates of all fields, but it is likely that those graduates in lower earning fields would be especially negatively affected, as student loan debt payments would eat up a greater share of income. Now, while it's the case that some arts graduates end up among the highest earners, on average, earnings by arts graduates are low. And many arts graduates could then make more money working outside of field of study. As for some sub-questions I'll address as well, how does this impact differ relative to non-arts graduates? And then also, how does this impact who ends up working in the arts? My hypothesis here is that student loan debt is going to have a negative impact on the likelihood an arts graduate is working in the arts. A little bit of theory behind my hypothesis and research question here. And specifically, I would say this issue relates to the work preference model of Throsby. Now, what this model suggests is that artists are going to try to maximize their time available for artistic creation, subject to the need for some minimum level of income necessary for survival. Compare this to our traditional utility maximizing model, where there is a trade-off between labor and leisure. Outside of the arts, we think that workers want to work to make money that they can then use for consumption that'll bring them positive utility, though time spent working is time spent away from family and doing other activities. So there's some trade-off between working and the happiness that can be achieved with spending time away from work. Within the arts, we believe that artists enjoy the work that they're doing, or there's some utility generated through artistic creation. If you're an artist, you may be passionate about your work, so you might want to be working in the arts. However, you need some level of income to get by. Now, how does student loan debt then play into this work preference model? Well, student loan debt is going to be the minimum level of income necessary for survival. You have to make your student loan payments if you have student loan debt associated with your college education. And as a result, you need enough income not only to pay for rent and food and other expenses, you also need to make enough income to cover your student loan payments. As a result, student loan debt is going to potentially raise that minimum level of income necessary to survive. What that may mean is that for artists that are not among the highest earners, this may push more arts graduates into non-arts occupations as they need to make this income to survive. A little bit of touch on literature. And first, a few pieces related to the careers of arts majors. Now, there is some disparity or some conflict in some sense in the data when it comes to thinking about what share of arts college graduates are actually working in the arts. Works that have used SNAP data. SNAP is the Strategic National Arts Alumni Project. Work using SNAP data, like Lindman et al. 2012, have found that a relatively large share of arts graduates are working in a field related to the arts, though this is kind of self-reported. Works using the American Community Survey, so US Census data, like Wassel and Alper 2018, find that a relatively small share of graduates are working in the arts. Specifically, Wassel and Alper 18 find that only 24% of arts graduates are working as artists. And their definition of artists there are like, artists as defined by the National Endowment for the Arts here in the US. As for why arts graduates are not working in the arts, the SNAP survey does ask arts graduates why they're not working as professional artists, if that's the case. And the top 3 most reported reasons from Lena et al. 2014 that artists are not working as professional artists was that they had higher or steadier pay in another field, artistic work was not available, and debt. So those are the top 3 reported reasons for not working as professional artists. Now, there's also a wealth of literature looking at the impact of student loan debt on college graduates generally, not specific to the arts. Rothstein and Rouse, 2011, looks at a sample of graduates from a selective college that implemented a no-loan policy in the 2000s. And what they found was that student loan debt caused students to choose substantially higher salary jobs. So it was the case that, when the no loans policy was implemented, their graduates were willing to take jobs that might have come with lower pay. Another paper, Gicheva 2016, looks at a sample of GMAT registrants and finds that student loan debt has a negative impact on the likelihood of marriage. And then another paper here Mesa, Ringo, Sherlin, and Summer 2020, finds that student loan debt has a negative impact on home ownership. So pretty clear from the literature outside of the arts that student loan debt has the potential to impact career choices and other life choices as well. Moving into the data for this study, I used the National Survey of College Graduates for this paper. Now, this is a survey run by the National Science Foundation. Data is collected from a sample of about 150,000 college graduates. It's a random sample of graduates. It's a survey that's conducted every 2 years, and it has questions on a variety of topics, including demographics, education, employment, and more. Now, specifically here, I use data from the 2015, 2017, and 2019 samples, and I focus on graduates with a bachelor's degree but no higher. Now, quickly addressing advantages of using the National Survey of College Graduates over other data on US arts graduates. And specifically, I'll compare the NSCG to the American Community Survey and SNAP, which are probably the two most commonly used data sources in the literature on US graduates. For the ACS, the American Community Survey does not include information on student loan debt. It also doesn't ask self-reported questions on whether graduates work in a closely related field to their degree. It does give data on earnings and occupations and education, but again, no information on student loan debt. And then comparing the National Survey of College Graduates to SNAP, SNAP is not a random sample, and it does not include information on non-arts graduates. So it doesn't allow for comparison between graduates of arts majors and graduates of other fields. As for the methodology, I'm going to use a mix of primarily descriptive tables, but then I'll supplement those descriptive tables with logistic regression results. And what I'll be doing is I'll be comparing student loan debt and career choices for college graduates with a bachelor's degree but no higher for all fields, and then I'll compare that to graduates of majors in the arts. As for the variables I'll be looking at, the primary outcome variable in the paper is whether or not a college graduate is working in a job that is closely related to their field of study. Now, the National Survey of College Graduates asked respondents to answer the question, to what extent was your work on your principal job related to your highest degree? So note here that this is a question about principal job. So it's possible that these workers may have multiple jobs, which is something we do see in the arts. Principal job, this is self-reported, though I would imagine that people are answering this question about, the job they're spending the most time at, or maybe the job that is leading to the most pay. And the question is, how closely is it related to your highest degree? Respondents can then choose among 3 choices: closely related, somewhat related, or not related. And then there are follow-up questions for those that answer not related. Specifically, those that answer not related are asked why. So why are you not working in a job closely related to your highest degree? And then they have 6 answer choices, which we'll see in a later table, along with an other option. The National Survey of College Graduates also asks other information about jobs for the respondents. Specifically, they'll ask about occupation, so we can make comparisons between what occupations the arts graduates are working in and whether or not they feel those occupations are closely, somewhat, or not related to their field of study. As for college majors, the National Survey of College Graduates allows respondents to enter up to 2 fields of study for their first bachelor's degree. And there are more than 100 fields of study to choose from. There are 4 majors in the National Survey of College Graduates that I choose to classify here as arts majors. And those majors are dramatic arts, fine arts, all fields, music, all fields, and then other visual and performing arts. So then a graduate or respondent here in the survey is considered to be an arts major if either their first or second reported major is in one of these 4 fields. And then as for the questions about student loans, respondents are asked to report how much money was borrowed to finance their student loans for their undergraduate degree, and then how much money is still owed. Rather than giving a concise dollar amount, respondents are given ranges, starting with 0 and then going in $10,000 increments up to 90,000 plus. First, I present here a table of descriptive statistics. And what you'll see here is that I've got comparisons between all majors, so the full sample, and then just those graduates with majors in the arts. And what we'll notice here is that there are some pretty clear differences between college graduates generally and then those with majors in the arts. We'll notice here first that arts majors are less likely to work in a job that is closely related to their field of study. For all college graduates, a little over half work in a job that they feel is closely related to their major field. For arts majors, that number is 37.9%, so quite a bit less. And notice here that where that difference is largely arts majors are much more likely to work in a job unrelated to their major field. We'll notice there are also some difference in borrowing patterns and demographics between the two groups. Arts majors are less likely to have no loans owed, or they're more likely to still owe student loan payments. And then it's also the case that arts majors have higher levels of parental education. So they're more likely to have either a mom or a dad that went to college. Arts majors are less likely to be first generation college graduates. What I'm going to present first here are tables reporting occupations of arts majors within the sample. And what I have here, the first table is going to show us the most common occupations for all arts majors. And then I break this table up into arts majors that report working in a job closely related to the major field of study, somewhat related, and not related. So what we'll see here, the first table gives the share of arts majors working in, I have 10 occupations here, the top 10 occupations I report. And you'll notice these occupation categories are relatively broad in the National Survey of College Graduates. But what you'll see here, probably not surprisingly, the most common occupation category for arts majors include writers, editors, PR specialists, artists, entertainers, and broadcasters at 17.1%. And then we'll see web developers here is at number 2, management occupations, other teachers and instructors, so we're talking like private tutors, dance instructors, marketing and sales are all common. Sales, also pretty common. We see computer science occupations, and then teachers, so secondary teachers, other subjects, so likely including art and music, and elementary as well. So these are the top 10 occupations for art majors overall. This table here is on reporting the top 10 occupations for art majors that are working in a job that they feel is closely related to their major field of study. And probably not surprisingly here, the most common occupation that is reported as closely related are writers, editors, PR specialists, artists, entertainers, and broadcasters at over 30%. Second on this list are teachers, secondary other subjects, so likely art and music teachers. And then we see some of the other occupations that we had noticed in the prior tables, managers, web developers, elementary teachers. Note here, there are a couple of surprises. We see RNs, pharmacists, dietitians, therapists, physician assistants, and nurse practitioners as being the 8th most common occupation that is reported as closely related. We do see college instructors here as well. If we're looking at these health occupations, it's possible, though we don't know without more details in the data. This might be, say, like, music or art therapists, for example, that could be viewed as closely related. This next table here shows top 10 occupations for arts majors that are working in jobs that they feel are somewhat related to their major field of study. And again, most common here are writers, editors, PR specialists, artists, entertainers, and broadcasters, though at a much lower percentage. Web developers is here too. We see marketing and sales, management, computer science. And again, a lot of these same categories that we've seen previously. Nothing too surprising here, other than maybe mechanical engineers. And then last, we've got the top 10 occupations for art graduates that are reported as not related. And what we'll see here, number one are other teachers, so private tutors, dance, etc. Sales is second most common. We have other management, other marketing and sales, network and computer systems, health occupations. We do see that seventh on the list is our writers, editors, PR specialists, artists, entertainers, and broadcasters category, which is somewhat interesting. Food prep and service, other health, transportation, precision, all here on this list. Now, some comments on these tables that we just looked at. Certainly the presented findings can help us to reconcile differences between what was found using SNAP data and what was found using the ACS previously in the literature. What we see here in our descriptive table 1 is that 63.9% of the art majors in the sample report working in a closely or somewhat related job. That's a number that's pretty consistent with what's found using SNAP data. So the self-reported numbers kind of match SNAP. As for the share that are actually working as artists, looking at the first table there with the occupations, maybe about 20% are working in jobs that could be considered as artists based on the NEA definition from Wassel and Alper 2018. So self-reported, more consistent with SNAP. Looking at the actual occupations is more consistent with the ACS. And then the other thing I'll point out here is that, probably not surprising that many of the education jobs are considered to be closely related. But some of the closely related jobs, like those in the health fields, I would say are a bit more surprising. So when we're thinking about what sort of occupations artists go into, what jobs that art majors think are closely related probably differ to some degree from what we might think of as being closely related.
May I just shortly interrupt with one question?
Absolutely.
We agreed at the start this can be done. What was the year of this survey?
So the survey years here were 2015, 17, and 19. And I believe the questions ask respondents about the prior year.
Yeah.
So 2015 would ask about 14, 16, and 18.
Okay, so this is not related. Okay, okay, thanks. I thought this could be related to the pandemic, but okay, thanks.
All of this is pre-COVID, yeah. Thank you. So now looking here at student loan debt, table 3 here presents the share of respondents that are working in a closely related occupation. And then I break this up by student loan status and major. So the first column here has shares working in closely related occupations for all majors or all college graduates. Then we look at just arts majors. And then I look at single arts majors. So arts majors here include both single majors and double majors. Within the US university system, probably 10 to 20% of all students declare a second major, which means that they're completing coursework in 2 fields of study. So these arts majors include some individuals that might have a second major that is not in the arts. The single arts majors, these are one major only, and that major is in one of those 4 arts categories. And what we'll notice here is that about 50% of graduates overall are working in a closely related occupation. And for those within all majors on average, there's not a huge difference in the share working in closely related occupations by student loan status. If we look instead at arts majors, so the second and third columns here, our arts majors and our single arts majors, what we'll notice here is that there are some differences in the share of arts majors working in a closely related occupation by student loan status. And I'll bring our attention here to those that owe debt and those that do not. For arts majors overall, 34.6% of those that owe student loan debt are working in a closely related occupation, while 39.4% are working in a closely related occupation among those that don't owe any debt. That's about a 17% difference. So if you owe student loan debt in this table, you're about 17% less likely to be working in a closely related occupation to your major. There is a difference between those that owe a high level of debt and those that owe a low level of debt. Here I split those that have student loan debt up into those that owe less than 50,000 and those that owe more than 50,000. And what we'll see here is that for arts majors, 38.3% that owe less than 50,000 are working in a closely related occupation. Only 31.7% that owe more than 50,000 are working in a closely related occupation. And these differences are a little bit more pronounced for single arts majors. It's possible within the arts majors overall that some of the double majors could be working in an occupation closely related to their other major. For single arts majors, this would only capture working in a job that's closely related to the arts. This is about a 21% difference between those that owe debt and those that do not. And that's an even more substantial difference for those that owe less than 50,000 versus more than 50,000. So taken collectively here, there appears to be some relationship between the amount of outstanding student loan balance and the likelihood an arts major is working in a closely related occupation. Table 3A here presents the same information, but I break this up into the 4 art major categories. So our dramatic arts, fine arts, music, and other arts majors. And what we'll notice here is that the pattern is pretty similar to what we had seen in the prior table. There is this negative relationship between owing student loan debt and working within a closely related occupation. Though we'll notice this is a bit more dramatic for the dramatic arts. Quite a large difference. Only 15.4% of those graduates with a major in the dramatic arts are working in a closely related occupation. Compare that to 26.5% for those that owe debt. It's about a 40% difference. A smaller difference for those in the fine arts, relatively large difference than music and other arts majors. Table 4 presents reasons for not working in a job related to the major field of study. So the sample here is only those that are not working in a closely related occupation or somewhat related occupation. And then I break this up by all majors versus our arts majors. And then I look at that further for our single arts majors and our single arts majors that have loans owed. And what we'll notice here is that overall, the most common reasons for not working in a job related to the major field, and note here that you can select more than one answer. So this is a select all that apply question within the survey. Overall, 66.3% of college graduates are not working in a job related to their major field because of pay. That's the most common reason selected. Followed closely by working conditions at 54.3% and location at 52.4%. If we look at art majors, we see a pretty similar pattern, though those numbers are a bit more dramatic. While that is a reason selected by 66.3% of all majors, 74.5% of arts majors select pay as a reason for not working a job related to the major field. That number 75% for single art majors and 78.6% for single art majors with loans owed. So pretty clear that pay is an important reason that art majors are not working in jobs related to their major field of study. And then the other thing I'll point out here, where we see a difference, jobs not available is a far more common selection for single art majors, and especially those single art majors that owe student loans. So again, kind of consistent with the story that we're seeing, student loan debt being a reason for art majors not working in a job closely related to their major field of degree. Table 4A here presents the same information, but again, breaking this up by our 4 categories of arts major. And what we'll see here is that pay is an even more important reason within the dramatic arts and music. And those were areas where student loan debt seemed to matter more. A little bit less important in the fine arts and other arts majors where student loan debt seemed to matter a little bit less. So again, kind of consistent with the story that we're seeing to this point. Now, to supplement the descriptive tables, I present logistic regression results, where the dependent variable, the binary variable that takes on a 1, if the individual is working in a job closely related to their major field of study. And then I include controls in these regressions. So I include controls for demographics, so age and age squared, and indicators for race, ethnicity, sex, marriage, and children. I include parental education, so a little bit of like socioeconomic background here, with indicators for father with a bachelor's or higher and a mother with bachelor's or higher. I also include some college characteristics. So the National Survey of College Graduates gives us the Carnegie classification of the university that the student attended. So is the university classified as liberal arts, research, doctoral granting, comprehensive, an arts college, or other? And then I do include geographic indicators as well. And here we have a table showing these logistic regression results. Again, the dependent variable is a binary for whether the individual is working in a closely related occupation. And I have two regressions here. First, I include all college graduates. And then I have a regression where the sample is restricted only to arts majors. And what we'll see here for all college graduates, having no loans borrowed has a small negative impact on the likelihood of working in a closely related occupation. Having no loans owed has an insignificant impact. When we look at arts majors only, for arts majors, having no loans owed has a positive and significant impact on the likelihood of working in a closely related occupation, controlling for those things that we mentioned in the prior slide. So, the difference that we see in those tables persists when controlling for demographic information, family background, and college characteristics. And again, that's a pretty large effect. That's 7.1% from a mean of 37.9%. So about a 20% impact. Having no loans owned increases the likelihood of working in a closely related occupation by about 20%. And then the last table I'll present here looks at demographic characteristics of single art majors based on whether they're working in a closely related occupation or an unrelated occupation to their major field of study. And what we'll notice here is that those workers that are working in closely related jobs relative to those that are in unrelated jobs are more likely to be white and male. Those workers are also more likely to have a parent with a college degree or higher, so less likely to be a first-gen student. So what this might suggest here is that student loan debt may have distributional impacts on who ends up actually working as an artist among college graduates with majors in the arts. Student loan debt has a potential to lead to college graduates with degrees in the arts to be more likely to come from like white and male backgrounds, more likely to have parents with higher education. So some conclusions. Overall, I find that student loan debt has a negative impact on working in closely related occupations for arts majors. The effect is larger for graduates with greater levels of debt. The effect is consistent with pay being the most common self-reported reason for not working in a closely related occupation. And we find that student loan debts have an outsized impact on the career choices of art majors relative to non-arts college graduates. So this is a phenomenon that's kind of specific to arts majors. Student loan debt also has potential distributional impacts on who works as artists, as those in closely related occupations are more likely to be white, male, and have highly educated parents. And of course, this impact comes on top of institutionalized racism and a weak social safety net in the US that is also likely to keep minorities and individuals from disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds out of the arts. And certainly if you're not familiar with the US, institutionalized racism is a major problem. We have a education system for K through 12 that is based on, largely based on property taxes, but of course, those from less advantaged backgrounds are coming from largely segregated neighborhoods. Schools are of lower quality for minorities in the US generally. And certainly our weak social safety net means that, our college graduates with degrees in the arts need to worry about getting health insurance coverage and being able to survive. So certainly this impact comes on top of these other concerns. Now, how could we potentially address this issue? Here are some general policy tools that could be used to address the issue of student debt among arts majors. Certainly general student loan debt relief would affect all college graduates, but also would certainly impact arts graduates. So if President Biden were to relieve $10,000 in student loan debt for all college graduates, that would potentially benefit arts graduates as well. We could imagine policies put in place to target arts graduates specifically with student debt relief. It's already the case in the US that individuals that work in the public sector or sometimes educators receive student loan debt relief. We could imagine programs that target an arts graduate specifically. Certainly increase public funding for financial aid, more grants, fewer loans could help arts graduates. We've heard policy proposals revolving around free or reduced costs of public college, community colleges, all that. And then certainly improvements to the social safety net in the US. Programs like a universal basic income, Medicare for all, or more would help to alleviate the need for arts graduates to work in occupations outside of the arts. And then my last slide here, some directions for potential future work here. I focus on arts graduates with a bachelor's degree but no higher. There's certainly the potential to look at arts graduates with master's degrees or beyond to see how student loan debt affects career choices of those with higher education beyond a bachelor's. Certainly improved data could lead to stronger causal inference. What I'm suggesting here might be a causal relationship, but I use caution with causal language because I'm using logistic regression here. Certainly there's potential to look at the impact of policy changes surrounding COVID-19. Now, the data is not out yet necessarily to let us look at the COVID-19 pandemic, but once that data is out, there was a student loan payment pause that came with the pandemic. That could be an interesting, policy to look at as it relates to student loan debt and the careers of arts majors. And then certainly looking at the interaction between student debt and economic conditions, is it the case that graduates who graduated during a recession are even more sensitive to having student loan debt and their career choice than those that graduated in stronger economies? That's all I've got. So at this point, I'll certainly open up the questions, and I've got contact information here if you want to get in touch with me too. And here, I will stop my share so that I can see all of you.
Thanks.
Of course.
Okay, thanks a lot. Virtual clap, of course. Great. I open the floor to questions. There is one in the chat.
Let's see. I can certainly read this. Let's see.
Maybe Joanna, is it possible that you ask this question live?
Sure. Sorry, I have some background music, but happy to do that. Thank you, Richard. So happy to see you and hear about this paper since I'm doing so much work on this, and I think our research areas overlap so much. So my question is really just around expectations and the design of higher education in the arts, because I think the story that you tell is one that we're honestly well accustomed to, in that arts graduates have more debt. This obviously affects their career persistence, but I think we generally put this negative connotation on not pursuing a career in the arts while having an arts degree. But I often speak to, presidents of art schools, and they're starting to really talk about how arts graduates aren't necessarily even looking for jobs in the arts. And so a job outside of the arts is looked as successful as a career outcome as a job inside of the arts. So I guess I wonder, how much do you think, at least, is this idea that, how much do you think the design of artistic higher education, in that, we're promoting entrepreneurial skill sets and general business development skills for artists, et cetera, how much is that, and then these expectations altogether that artists can work outside of their career fields, how much is that possibly driving what you're finding here in terms of career persistence? in the arts?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely a good question, and certainly something I've thought about too. I'm sure you know I've got the paper with Neil and Greg that looks at arts majors and as entrepreneurs and innovators, right? So I'm well aware that we're seeing a lot of this in artistic higher education. It's possible it's driving it. I mean, it's interesting that there is a difference between those with debt and those without, and that there are potential distributional effects of this. Yeah, I think we could potentially answer this question by looking at more historical data. It's a more recent trend, if my understanding is correct, toward entrepreneurship education within the arts and kind of this push toward working outside the arts. So I'd be curious to see if this effect is similar historically, or if it's a more recent trend, whether that be comparing more recent graduates to, more distant graduates, or looking at older data. Yeah, it's a good question. I think it could be answered, but it's not being answered, at least with the current data.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. That's a good way to try to look at it. The SNAP data is actually quite interesting because I think it's 18, I might be wrong here, so don't quote me on this, but I think it's 18% or around there of their arts graduates that are surveyed that actually don't even intend to go into careers in the arts. So that being said, they're getting these degrees to go into other fields. And that might mean like arts management, or what you found like occupational therapy or something like that, but they didn't necessarily intend to be artists. So there's more to explore there, but I was just thinking that one way that you kind of get at this is through looking at the binary between those who have debt and those who don't have debt, and then career persistence. And then that differential sort of helps explain that. But I do think that there's sort of more to be looked into there, because we have this like general, positivity about, if you get an arts degree, you go and be an artist, and that's success as an artist. But in general, I actually don't think that that's the case anymore, especially you're right in talking about sort of contemporary circumstances. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Thanks. Any additional question? Stephen, please.
Yeah, I have a couple of different questions. I'm particularly interested in the double major phenomenon, and in your data, the arts majors, but what, for those that are double majors, what else they majored in. And I wonder if you've explored at all the explanatory power of that. So if a student is majoring in English and fine arts, or English and music, that's one thing. If they're majoring in economics and arts, or chemistry and the arts, then one almost has the impression of that individual as, well, what I'm really doing is majoring in economics because I'm planning on a career in business, or going to graduate school or whatever, but I love the arts passionately and I want to do that as well. And so I wondered if you've explored that particular aspect of the data.
So I haven't. Certainly the regression controls for whether they have a second major. I could potentially break the control up into what the field of their second major is. So I mean, that data is there. In part, I haven't explored it because, if we're looking at a sample of 2,500 artists within the larger sample here, and 10 to 20% are double majors. I don't remember the exact number within the data here, but it's a relatively small sample size. But it would be interesting to see if there is some heterogeneity. If we, I could group the second major pretty broadly, sciences, business, these other related fields, there might be something there. Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of work out there that's interesting on double majors. I know, there's a paper, I forget what it's called, like one for me, one for the parents or something, right? Where it's, you can imagine we've got these individuals that are arts majors, that they've got their business major, science major that makes the parents happy. They like their arts classes, that is their second major. Their plan was never to actually work in the arts. And that is in part why I do break it up and look at the single arts majors, because I do worry that is some overlap within the sample that includes double majors. It might not be their intention to work in the arts generally. But yeah, I mean, that's certainly an interesting area to pursue. And you know, there are more years of National Survey of College Graduate data that I could include to potentially broaden that sample size and look at the double major issue. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so that makes me think of another question that I had. So as I understand the data, the works in a closely related field is completely self-declared.
Yes.
So it's whether they consider it closely related, whereas an external observer might go, I mean, so they might be teaching at a middle school where they teach history and music. And so they go, well, most of my teaching is I'm teaching 3 history classes and only 2 music classes. So I guess it's not closely related. But, you know, and so I wonder if you have thought about a way to explore that. I mean, do the data include anything about the industry in which they're employed?
I don't believe there is an industry indicator. I mean, they give occupation. I can look and see. The American Community Survey certainly gives industry. I'm not sure the National Survey of College Graduates does, but that is a good question. No, it might. Industry is something I could explore. And certainly within the logistic regressions, I could do a separate set of regressions where the outcome is, you know, are they working within that occupation category that includes artists, right? So I mean, that could be the outcome instead of closely related, to see if there's something there too.
Right, and you know, I don't know whether if someone majored in fine arts and is now working as an assistant director of a small art museum, personally, I think that might be reasonably said to be a person working in a closely related field, but they may not regard themselves as such because most of their time is spent trying to make the stupid box office software work properly or whatever. And so
yeah.
you're getting information not only about what they're employed doing, but about how they perceive that employment.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think some of those initial descriptive tables were interesting in that there are differences between what is reported as closely related, somewhat or not related, but there's so much overlap among the 3 too, you know, so it's self-reported data is always interesting to see what people think about their occupation.
Yeah. And my last question is, you really don't have any information about the institutions, or do you have just the broad institutional class like liberal arts, R1, etc.?
Yeah, I just have the broad institutional class. So is it liberal arts, research, comprehensive, doctoral granting, or an art school, or other. I don't know specifically like rank of the institution or anything like that. It would be nice.
Yeah, because what would be really nice in terms of teasing out the causal relationship, because you've got, you know, with Princeton and Amherst and a few of these other places that have dropped the loans, you've got a perfect natural experiment.
Yeah, I do wonder. I know this data is collected. I know it's not publicly available, I think because of, you know, identifying information, but it's potentially something that could be requested. You know, so I mean, you know, looking into requesting to see if I could have, you know, it would be more restricted access or something, you know, high security, all that fun stuff, but they have the information. It's a matter of getting your hands on that information. Yeah.
Right. You mentioned you have controls for geography. Is the geography the location of the student when they respond to the survey?
Yeah, so I believe it's they're like broad regional indicators in the US. I don't believe it's state. I believe it's a little bit broader than state. So I know Northeast versus, you know, West or whatever that may be. And I believe they're responding for their location for where they are living, I would assume. I don't believe it's where they're working. I believe it's where they're living. Though with how broad those indicators are, where they're living is where they're working. Yeah.
But I noticed that in the, you know, reasons for not working, you know, the location was one of the more frequently, wasn't the most, but it factored as a rationale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd be curious to see how location interacts with those that are married, for example. Maybe they have a spouse in a higher earning field that is working somewhere that prevents them from being able to work in the arts. Yeah, that is an interesting question. Yeah.
And do you know the gender of the respondent?
Yes. Yeah, so it'd be interesting to see if there's some gender differences or gender, well, interacting gender with marriage potentially too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Richard, I have one more question. So I'm sorry, remind me again when the data are collected. So how long after the individuals graduated?
So the National Survey of College Graduates is collecting, it's a sample that comes from the American Community Survey. So ACS is a 1% sample. Some subset of the ACS is then asked to fill out the National Survey of College Graduate questionnaire. So this includes individuals of all ages. There is a survey of recent graduates also conducted by the National Science Foundation, though that's a much smaller sample. So this includes anyone at any distance from when they potentially graduated. I am controlling for age and age squared in the regressions.
Okay. So have you potentially tried to condition on wages? So I would love to, for example, like if you take a look at artists, a lot of them have wage as of 0. And actually, if you take those out, you start to get a really big difference between on a lot of measures. I feel like if you conditioned on wages and maybe even like household income, since the ACS has that, you could start to get at sort of what are those forms of support, these like deeper questions that you're starting to think about. But yeah, that's just been my experience.
Yeah, no, I haven't to this point, but those would be interesting controls to add potentially to tease out the causal effect. Yeah, thank you.
Maybe also I have a question. Hopefully others can respond as well. Firstly, I do not know if I understood this correctly, but you have a variable of income or an income-related variable, which is of interval nature. I don't know if I have understood this correctly. How have you dealt with this variable, which is not point specified, but in a range, right? Is this correct?
So the student loan variable is what's in ranges. There is income also. I have not explored income or controlled for income, but that is something I could potentially control for. The student loan variable, you're correct, is either 0 or like 1 to 10,000, 10 to 20,000, up to like 90,000 plus. To this point in the regressions, I've only used a binary variable for do they have debt or not have debt. I haven't looked at, I've thought about, for example, maybe picking the midpoint, say, within each of those ranges and treating it as a continuous as opposed to binary. Or, there is that one table where I break it up into, is 50,000 or less or 50,000 or more. So there is more that I could explore with the level of debt, potentially, yeah.
Interesting. And one more substantial question. Basically, I didn't understood this quite correctly. What do you think is the mechanism that drives the difference between the art and related majors and the general population? I don't know if I understood also the regression, the main results part with the significance tables. You had the first regression where the coefficient was of an opposite sign and significant for the general population, and then a very reduced sample of about 2,000 where the effect was negative and significant with a very low R square of about 1%. What do you think is the mechanism that drives this difference between art majors and general majors in terms of the loans? Because one would expect that loans would naturally also have an influence on other sectors, and also in terms of relationships between occupations. Probably you would expect some substitution effects and similar or complementary effects. How to control for those relationships between sectors and between occupations similar? Thanks.
So starting with kind of the first question there, what I think is the mechanism underlying the difference. For art majors, I think there's the potential to earn more outside of the arts. You know, the average art graduate, the average artist has relatively low earnings, where you might be able to get a job as a secretary or a job in food service that is providing your primary income outside of the arts, or maybe, you know, a job in entrepreneurship, or, you know, a job at a company in marketing or something, right? If we compare that to non-arts graduates, and certainly there's the potential for heterogeneity across majors, right? But if you are an engineering major in college, working as an engineer is probably the highest paid occupation you could get afterwards. So in terms of the impact of student debt, whether you've got debt or not, you probably want to work as an engineer. Or, you know, if you major in nursing in college, working as a nurse is probably the occupation that will lead to the highest earnings for you. You may want to work in that field. You know, compared to the arts, unless you end up being a superstar artist that has high earnings, it's very possible that, you know, rather than working as an extra on Broadway, you might make more money working, you know, in business and HR and some related field. So I think that's kind of the mechanism there, is that, you know, artists have generally low earnings relative to other potential occupations associated with majors. So that was your first question. I think the mechanism.
Isn't it possible, if I just interrupt you, you mentioned the Crosby's model at the start, because artists usually have also very different motivations for work, and money has not such a great importance. Could it be possible there are different mechanisms also inside here? And
potentially. Yeah, I mean, my thought with student loan debt, right, is that, you know, for all artists, there is this intrinsic motivation potentially to want to work in the arts. Now, maybe that's not the case. You know, maybe some want to work as entrepreneurs, but, you know, we think there is this potential intrinsic motivation. If you have student debt, that makes it even harder for you to clear that hurdle of the money you need to make to survive, I think is, you know, what I'm thinking from a theoretical perspective. Yeah.
Okay.
Now, can you remind me of your follow-up question there? Because I think I forgot.
Substitution effect between different sectors. Could this also have relevance, and could it be controlled?
Yeah, certainly I should consider controlling for industry if it's possible. If you're looking at I know you had mentioned the R-squareds, comparing those two regressions. The first regression with the full sample of college graduates, I control for major in that regression. So controlling for undergraduate, and, you know, that's 100 additional controls that drives up the R-squared for sure. Within the arts regression, the sample is restricted just to those arts majors, which is why the R-squared is substantially lower. There's not those controls for individual major.
Would it make sense to make also a pooled regression with your art major controls? Could this contribute?
Oh, yes, I could. So I haven't to this point. I haven't controlled for the individual art major than that, but that is something to consider too.
Okay.
Can I jump in? I have a follow-up that your question, Andre, prompted me to think about, and that is, I thought it was particularly interesting, some of the differences between drama, fine arts, and music. And you didn't say a lot about that, but I wonder if you have thoughts about what might explain some of those differences. And related to that is a question about, I don't think your data would allow you to test this, but it seems to me there's a question about, is it the low level of wages or the sort of dynamic uncertainty of it that, you know, if you're trying to make it as an actor in New York, and you do get to be, when you said in your explanation about being an actor on, you know, being an extra in a Broadway play, well, if you manage to get that, you probably think of yourself as doing really well. It's the 9 months of doing nothing and going to various and sundry auditions, that's the real problem. And maybe for something like a student loan debt, where you're kind of forced into needing to make these regular payments, that dynamic uncertainty in earnings might be a larger problem than or as much of a problem as the level of earnings. And I wonder if that might not explain some of the differences between the types of art majors.
Yeah, I hadn't necessarily thought about the explanation, though my hope is that people would have some suggestions for why those differences might persist. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point. I wish the question, broke pay up into subcategories, right? It'd be great if it was level of pay versus consistency of pay, right? It unfortunately doesn't. I don't know if the SNAP survey does or not. It's possible the SNAP might break that up a little bit further. It's something I'd have to look into further. But yeah, I mean, that's certainly a good point. Yeah, I don't have any other thoughts on why there might be those differences, but I could also compare average income levels, all that kind of stuff too.
And to get data on just what the magnitude of the uncertainty of the dynamic fluctuation is, you really are going to need some sort of longitudinal,
yeah, absolutely,
data.
True.
Richard, I have two related questions. I don't know if our colleague who joined a little bit later has any question or comments. Sorry, I cannot read the Chinese, so I cannot pronounce your name. All right. Yeah. So overall, the purpose of the problematic of your study is to look at the sort of efficiency of the college system vis-a-vis of the arts field. That is, if, as Joanna was referring to, if the basic assumption is that there must be, so what we aim to is a correspondence between the type of studies and the type of work we end up doing. So first of all, I can see a social component from the data you presented. That is, arts-related major tend to be white, female, and from a quite educated milieu, so which could also be a proxy for average, if not higher, wealthy milieu. So my question for you is, do you have any information in your data about the purposes of students enrolling in these majors? So did they enroll in this major with the aim of getting a job in an arts-related field, or not necessarily? This could be a very important information for your study, because that could be not necessarily the case. When I taught in arts-related programs, well, especially at graduate level in the United States, that was the case of some students. They were not there necessarily to then get a job in the arts. And then I have a more radical, so to speak, a question for you. I mean, if the purpose of your studies is to find a matching between studies and occupation, do you have any information about professional artists or people working in highly related jobs to the arts who did not study arts related, who did not do arts related studies at all, either other studies or no studies at all. I know that in the United States, professional qualification is more dependent on studies than in other areas, like in Europe, for instance. And following what Stephen was saying, there are artistic fields where an arts major is rather important. Consider, for instance, music, which is also shown in your results. This is also the case of architecture or design, but it's less the case of fine arts and drama. Do your data allow you to investigate on these aspects?
So first question, no, there's not a question asking if a student studied the arts because they want to work in the arts afterwards. That'd be a good question to have in this data set, but that's not there. I think Joanne had mentioned like it is included in the SNAP data, but the SNAP data doesn't include non-arts majors. So it's not a question that's asked here, so we don't know their intentions. As for your second question, within the data, I can figure out what the other majors are of people that are working within the different occupation groupings. So I could see for sure, you know, what are the majors of other people that are working as artists or within that artists occupational grouping. It's not as detailed as I might like. Like the American Community Survey has far more detailed occupations and could be used to figure out who is working as an artist. This specific survey only includes college graduates. It does not include those without any higher education. Though the American Community Survey does include individuals both with and without college degrees. The problem though with the American Community Survey is there's no information on student debt. But yeah, there's certainly good American data out there that could look at who is working as an artist. Not as much this data set beyond college graduates.
You know why the two questions are related? Because if, but I doubt about that, the just enrolled students had a longer perspective in terms of a longer term perspective, they could even decide, okay, instead of embarking myself in getting in a debt, better not to enroll at the university and try an arts-related career without studying. So that is weighing the effects of getting a loan now with all the consequences of that, of paying it back, or instead renouncing to get the loan and therefore education and try an arts-related career. So that is, my question is to consider more options available for our final desired state that is working as an artist or in a close closely artistic field.
Yeah, something that can be done in the data. I do know when the individual graduated from college. So I mean, I could potentially tease out, did you go to college at 18 and graduate at 22 and major in the arts? Or did you wait a few years, go to college a little bit later and graduate, say in your late 20s or 30s or something? So there might be differences potentially between, you know, debt and working in the arts, between those that were traditional college students that went immediately after high school compared to those who went later on. I don't know sample sizes at this point without looking at the data further, but we could potentially look at, you know, it is more of a choice if you're going to school later on in a certain field potentially than if you're choosing this major at 18. Yeah.
Maybe also just two additional questions, very short ones. Firstly, I also think it is important, the aspect that I think Elizabeth touched, this aspect of education and the arts. We know that the artists are not that related to education. Frequently also artists make career despite, or it's not that correlated, I think, with their educational experience. Maybe this could also relate to some of the work. And additionally, would it be possible that also in different years, depending on circumstances, in particular in these years that we are living now, the role of the debt would be different, possibly also for different for different groups, different sectors?
Yeah, I think it certainly be, yeah, it definitely would be interesting to look at the interaction between economic conditions at graduation and are they ending up in the arts or not, in debt and all that. Yeah, I mean, that's certainly something I think that can be done in the data. I don't know if that's something I'd include in this paper or a follow-up paper, but yeah, it's definitely a question that could be answered, I believe, with this data. Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks. Okay, anything further?
No.
I think it was a great debate and so on. I hope we continue it so soon. Thank you for a great presentation. Thank you for all the questions from the audience, and to everybody who came. As I mentioned at the start, the webinar was recorded. It will be put online today or tomorrow, I hope. So thank you greatly and hoping to see you.
I would like also to add,
Please.
we hope, Richard, to have the opportunity to listen to the follow-up of your research in this sense. We hope that you got interesting suggestions for to follow up in this research that we hope to listen to in one of the next conferences or workshops face-to-face also of the International Association for Cultural Economics.
Indeed.
Thank you.
And also on CEOS, possibly another time.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you guys for having me.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Very
And
interesting.
thank you to everybody.
Bye. Thanks.